the transitional government in Libya, when it ever will be in place.
But look what's happened with Yemen. They had in their decisions in the
I always
discussions and
perfect. I just mentioned it as the perfect example that you need to be persistent because there's always setbacks. Because now the Yemeni women have to just fight for the same thing they already had reached.
Exactly. Oh, thank God! If Dr. Paffenholz just validated something, it means like I'm Lina. It's okay. My mind is functioning. Thank God. No, but really, it's so sad. Like I talked to Russia and Ghana and all these people in Yemen, and they're so frustrated with like all the work they did, and the setback is real. It's real haram.
It is. It's really bad. And also, it's now with the listing of the Houthis as a terrorist group, it doesn't make it easier.
Yep.
No. The Houthis, I thought it was fake news, but they're requesting, you have to get an approval from their authorities for every Zoom call. Every Zoom call you do, it's
No, it's true.
Really?
I heard that too.
I thought it was fake news. I'm like, no way. Like, how can they even control that? But they have a mechanism.
Fake.
Yeah.
No, it is because they realized everything is going on Zoom and online. So there's no point of restricting meetings because there are not any.
I think we are 6.
64. I just want to avoid the beep 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 until at least we have.
I know. I tried different ways to mute this beeping, but it mutes everything. So no.
What's your favorite mode of digital communication, Tanya? Is it Zoom? Is it?
The only thing I really don't like is Skype for Business. I find very complicated, and
I hate Skype for Business.
Exactly. And there's another one. I don't know. I mean, they're all the same.
I would say because the Swiss always use Skype for Business.
Exactly. And every time we talk to the Swiss, we end up with WhatsApp calls on their private mobile phones.
Absolutely. And the first 10 minutes, I always miss the first 10 minutes of every meeting. I'm not there because it doesn't work.
Yeah, thank you. Also allowing for my colleagues to join, because we yesterday had a discussion in our team that I should do some internal learning events. I said no, I have no time for that. Just join in when I give some talks, and then we can take it from there.
No, welcome to Lebanon, ladies.
Exactly. Are you all? Where are you?
I'm in Kenya.
Oh, you are in Kenya.
Yeah, I'm in Kenya.
What's the time zone?
I think I'm 1 hour ahead of you. 1 hour ahead of you. And there's my colleague Sarah from New York, colleague Ashley from Washington, and colleague Julia from Geneva.
It's so great to see you, Sarah.
Welcome to Lebanon virtually.
So, I mean, we can also, of course, in the discussion profit from having our women, peace and security policy expert guru here.
Of course. Last time I saw Sarah was in Rome in 2019 in December. I think that was my last trip probably before.
Those were the days.
I was just thinking about that. I'm pretty sure that was actually my last trip.
Yeah,
as well. It's so good to see you. It's so
you too. You too. So you're left IPI? No.
Yeah. So I'm a director now with Tanya. I'm one of the directors, and
no, I saw, but I didn't know if they were straddling or. All right.
No. I'm getting to do my passion all the time.
Great. Should I start, Dr. KG? Should I go ahead?
Start, and I think the colleagues can disappear on the camera.
Okay, we have 97 now, so which is perfect. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, Karma, go ahead.
Good evening, TLSers. Good evening, Dr. Krediye. We are so honored today to have with us as guest speaker Dr. Tanya Pfaffenholz. I'm, so honored that you have accepted this invitation to speak to our 100 brilliant students, 100 plus, from different disciplines. And they're all taking this gender program to better understand how gender equality is multidisciplinary, that it goes across, all sectors, that gender or inclusivity is not a separate science or art that we study on its own. It's something that needs to be mainstreamed into our lifestyles. And we are so happy to have you with us today, especially because our students are reading you. And I'm sure that they will enjoy very much the lecture that you have prepared for us. And they will be eager to ask you questions directly. I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce you and then leave the floor to you, Dr. Pfaffenholz. So Dr. Tanya Pfaffenholz is the Director of Inclusive Peace, a Geneva-based think and do tank operating globally in support of peace and political transition processes. With 30 years of experience as both an academic and a practitioner and a policy advisor, Dr. Pfaffenholz is internationally renowned for her work on and in support of peace and political transition processes worldwide, focusing on mediation and peace building and process design, which is key when we talk about peace building and dialogues and peace processes. Inclusion and participation are her bread and butter, as well as the conditions under which peace processes produce sustainable outcomes, long-term outcomes. In recognition of her work, Dr. Pfaffenholz received the prestigious Wihuri International Prize in 2015. She is also known for her research and practical support work on and for women inclusion in peace processes, and lead author of the seminal study, Making Women Count, that our students are reading. Dr. Pfaffenholz has roots in Europe and Africa and is mother of 2 children. Thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kama, for this very, very nice welcome and nice introduction. And it's a shame that I cannot be physically with you because I very much like to be in Beirut, which is a go-to place for me usually. So I think Kama has offered to share the presentation because we had some tech issues with me sharing. So I have a presentation which I think the leaders of this course can then also share with you. So after the course, after the talk. Yeah. So let me give you the overview. So I named the presentation "Making Women Count in Negotiating Peace and Political Transition Processes." This "Making Women Count" actually title, that's also the title of that famous study, came really because what we found in a lot of research is there's a lot of counting of women, like how many women are represented here, how many women are there. And there's not a lot, or there has been not a lot of talk on how women can influence processes, which might not just be a number game. But that's, I think, how we came up with this Making Women Count. And I will focus the talk on negotiating peace and political transitions. And as I know, you are looking into negotiation, conflict resolution, and mediation. So I think I'm touching these areas. I'm very happy that you are an interdisciplinary group of people, because that's the only way we can tackle these problems, because we need more brains than just a few political scientists or others. So let's move to the table of content, which is the next slide. So I don't know where Karma has disappeared, but then she can't share my slide as she disappeared. But I guess she will come. I will, in the meantime, until she's back, which I hope will be in a second, let me just tell you what I will talk about. I will talk about why we are talking about women and also gender in peace processes. what are the barriers to women inclusion, and what are the structures of influence? That means the roles and the modalities of inclusion. What are the strategies to influence, and what are the factors to enable and constrain women's influence? This is basically, if you read the study or if you read other publications I have, this is basically a mixture, I think, of the writing I've done and also the experiences with supporting women in different processes all over the world. So it's a bit of a mixture of this. So I'm wondering, Lena, do you think, should I share the presentation with you? Should I send it to you, or how do we go about it? Or do you hear anything from Karma's return?
Yes, if you want to share it with me, and I'll. Karma has to stop sharing so I could share.
Yes.
So I hope
let
you can
just,
reconnect again. Yes.
Yeah, let me just very quickly get you the presentation. Or can you send me, I'm sorry, can you send me an email? Or while maybe my colleague Julia, you can send it. And let me see.
Or she can share.
basically-
Or if any of your.
Yeah,
Okay.
can you put your email in the chat then to everybody? Then everybody of my colleagues can. I can also quickly share it.
Yeah. Okay. Here's
Sorry
Karma on
for
the
this.
phone. Karma,
دكتور انا عم بشوفكم عم بسمعكم كل شيء عادي.
are you sharing? Are you able to move the screen?
Yeah, but you're not hearing me.
Oh, غريب.
I'm gonna go out and come back in, and I
Okay.
emailed you the presentation already. You don't have
Okay.
it. The presentation is in your inbox.
I don't see it, but I'll check now. Okay,
Sorry
no
for
problem.
this. You have it?
Actually, not yet.
Okay, just put your email into the chat, and then we're gonna send it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes. I thought you have my email. Okay, let me.
Yeah,
do
but I
that.
need to then first
Okay. Yeah.
look for it. It's gonna be very quick. I have it already. None of the colleagues need to send it. I have it already. I just need to get your email address. Second. So this is already the beauty of digital communication and practice and troubleshooting at the same time. Just get to this, and here you go. The presentation is just sent to you. And while we are fixing this,
Mm-hmm.
I think as you're all used to presentations, I'm going to start the presentation
Please.
Yes, in saying, so why are we talking about this topic at all? And I actually just came out of a meeting with the UN and others where my colleague Sarah, who's also here today, was moderating about temporary special measures, means quota and others. And it's really interesting. So why are we still talking about this topic? And I think it is because despite the fact that we have all the normative frameworks in place, and I think this is a key issue that people say, hey, there are all the norms and the frames, and why are we still talking about it? But then, as we all know, it's not enough to have normative frameworks. We also need to put them in action. There's different arguments why we're talking about that. I think the most natural is that women are 50% of the population, and this is an argument that very often comes from a rights-based approach, to say there is a right to participate. We just don't have to discuss it. It's 50%. There is a lot of traction in recent years, especially in the mediation community, to talk about the evidence-based argument. So there's evidence, and there is a lot of quantitative research that actually looked into the linkage between women presence at the table and how many peace agreements are signed, how many outcomes are gender sensitive, and so on. So, so there has been a lot of traction, but the interesting thing that happened, you can go right away to slide number 3. The interesting thing that happened in the meantime is that there is, I call it almost like a battle about evidence. You can just go to the next. I didn't know it's sliding in. Yeah, thank you very much. Leave it in. So I'm with the evidence-based argument, and no, just go back. Just go one slide back. Yeah. So, and then click another time. Okay. One more time. One more click, please. And yes, stop here. So the evidence-based argument basically says there's enough evidence that shows if you include women into peace processes, you're going to have gender-sensitive outcomes. If you would go still back to the slide, because we're not done with that. Yeah, just one back. So this means that there is a lot of what happened, what I call in this battle of the evidence. I'm really sorry for this flipping. I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, stop please the slide here. I don't know what's happening. Okay, then just leave it there and don't go away. So the problem with the evidence-based is that there's a lot of then attacks about methodology. So some researchers say, this is not the evidence, the methodology is not right, no, that methodology is not right. So you have a lot of arguments around it, and also quantitative research being sort of sometimes overshadowing the qualitative research. And there's a lot of battles about that. And others, of course, asking, why do we need the evidence battle? I mean, there's 50%. What about the rights-based approach? So I think, and then there is the effectiveness argument that people say, no matter what it is, whether there's evidence or not, or rights-based, is it not simply very effective to have women influencing processes? And we have the example of women leadership in the COVID-19 response, yeah, where apparently there is statistical evidence of more women leaders have had better COVID responses, and it's statistical evidence. But at the same time, people would argue, yes, it is a fact that it helps when you have probably men and women in the process because they have different perspectives. So you see, there are a number of arguments. And I repeat, from normative to rights-based to evidence-based to effectiveness-based. And it is not so much about, in my view, how you pick one and choose it. Just see there are lots of arguments. And if you want to argue for it, choose whatever makes sense for you. If we now go to the problem, why are all these norms and arguments already there, but we're still not there with equality? So, and then this brings us to what are the typical barriers for women and gender inclusion. And next slide. So I think the number one winner on our list is patriarchy. And I mean, that goes without saying, and there's also not much to be said about it. We could basically end the presentation here, because we can say everything else is a sort of underlying factor, but it's worth exploring these underlying factors. Let's go to the next slide. Click one more time. Just click it through until I say stop. Okay. And more and more and more. And one more and one more. Yes, stop. Okay. So what we see here is, my argument here is, a barrier to women inclusion is that even those who lobby for women inclusion have very confused goals, because they don't really know what they're lobbying for. So why is that like that? So see the gray ones. Are they lobbying for more women in the negotiations? That would be women's representation. Yeah. Or are they lobbying for a gender sensitive agreement? Yeah. that would be a gender inclusiveness in the text, for example, of the agreement, which means a very different strategy as to representation? Or are they lobbying for long-term outcomes, which means a just, peaceful, inclusive societies? So that means when we look at the red bubble, so what you want to influence, you need to be very clear about. And that is a real gap in those who are promoting actually gender justice. Just go back, stay with it. Yeah. Because if you want to influence, you need to know exactly what you want to influence, because the strategy of influencing change. If you want to influence representation, you lobby for a quota, for example. If you want to influence gender just outcomes, you make sure that there are people in the drafting team who use gender sensitive language, that there are technical working groups that have gender experts present. So it's a very different strategy. But interestingly, the most common lobbying is for representation. Besides the fact, interestingly, that we found in research, the most effective thing in that strategy actually is that you get the gender sensitive language and the outcomes and the provisions into the agreement that then allow to have also more representation in the post-agreement phase. Let's look at the blue bubble. Which women? Huge thing here, because there's actually a tension between those who push for feminist inclusion and for, let's call it, the rest. Because if you think about who should sit at the table, who should be part of a peace process or political transition process, all the lobbying usually goes into women. Women need to be there. But if you look into the different interest groups, they all mean different things. Some mean only feminists. No. We don't want, in Afghanistan, no. We don't want Taliban women at the table. Oh my goodness. No. They should have no right to be there. Others say, no, of course they should be there. They are also 50%. They should be there, the Taliban women. So there's a lot of discussions, and I have so far really not seen, even in the gender community, kind of an agreement. What is the lobbying for? Should there be some women that are excluded? I remember well when the Syria talk started, there was all this run on the opposition delegation and how representative it should be and empowering the few women in the delegation. Nobody asked about the government delegation, which was actually led by a woman. So a lot of gender experts would say, she's from the regime. So like, yes, but she's a woman. So what are you lobbying for? So I think that's a big issue. And it's often not made transparent what we think, what are the belief systems behind which women represent what. I think that's an important talk point. So I think takeaway from this slide is really be clear what you're lobbying for and have different goals and objectives in mind because they have different strategies. Thank you. Next slide. All right, just click one more time. So yeah, this is it. So there's a few others I would like to mention. I'm certain you all know a bunch of others as well. I would like to mention the first one, which I call preventative reduction of women demands. What does this mean? I call it the maybe factor versus the getting to yes in negotiations. You are certainly familiar with the Harvard concept of negotiation by now, about getting to yes and all this. Interestingly, when it comes to women inclusion, kind of the Harvard negotiator's head falls down and is replaced by, oh, maybe we could ask for 20%. Is that okay? Or should it be 30? You would never do that if you have a negotiator hat on. As a negotiator hat, you would say, let's go for 80%. And everybody would say, are you crazy? And then you would maybe end up with 40% or 50%. So it's very interesting in my observation that the sort of tough strategies in terms of getting to yes are not applied even by those who lobby for women inclusion at the table. The second point is a more recent one where we have more and more invited spaces for women to participate. For example, we had the Syria Women Advisory Body that would advise, is still there, that advises the UN Special Envoy. In Yemen, we have the Women Technical Advisory Body that advises the Special Envoy. We had also in Syria the Women Advisory Committee of the opposition that would advise the opposition delegation, and so on. So Women Advisory Body as invited spaces for women have become very popular. Interestingly, in earlier peace processes, take Colombia as an example, we would have much more claimed spaces where the women say, this is not enough. We want more representation. We want more gender expertise. We want this. And they went to the streets and pushed for this and got more representation and got more gender experts. And interestingly, and this is really an observation because we have not enough evidence for that yet, because there's not enough cases. I see that these modalities of invited spaces that are more away from the power centers have become very popular, but seem to not bring the same results as the claimed spaces with the push. So one could even argue, but as I said, there's not enough evidence for it. One could even argue that the invited spaces need to be carefully designed, that they don't take away the power of women movements to push. In the Yemeni case, for example, when the Women Technical Advisory Body was created, the women movement almost broke down over it. Who participates? Because the women movement was, of course, bigger, many groups, and suddenly 12 people were selected to be there, and everybody wanted to be there without analyzing, is this the only way of getting our issues to the table and into the process? So I think that's that point. Then there is a standard argument that it's all about the mediator and the conflict parties, that they basically don't want inclusion. Interestingly, I think that's of course too simple. And if you would talk to a lot of UN mediators, at least formally, nobody would say I'm against. It's usually more subtle. It's like, I'm absolutely for women inclusion. Gender is my thing. I'm a gender champion, but it's just the wrong time because at the moment we have just other things to discuss. You see, so that's a standard argument you will hear. At the same time, there's also, yes, the conflict parties, take the conflict parties. For the conflict parties, very often it has nothing to do with women. It has all to do with power. Who is powerful? And if a powerful person in the party is a woman, you will see, they don't care. They can have that woman at the table. So often conflict parties have less sort of issues actually in putting women to the table than have actually other actors. So it depends on how the women have been seen in the party and all this. You will have a lot of revolutionary movements. If you look at Nepal or Colombia, where women were extremely strong in the movement, you would also find more of them at the negotiation table. So it has to do, and in essence, also with the empowerment of women in society and within political parties. So if you are in a political party, and if political parties have more women representation, it is higher likely that women representation is a normal also when it comes to negotiations. So I think this is a very important starting point, looking into the political landscape and women representation there, and not only looking at the negotiation table. The last point here I would like to make is that there is really an overfocus on formal negotiations, especially in peace talks. Everybody talks about the table. Look at the Arab region. How many successful peace tables we have seen in the last 5 years? Can't tell. Very few. So why are we focusing on them and not focusing on other vehicles to discuss change and political transitions? Let's go to the next slide. I should announce the slides earlier. So the next slide is my favorite slide. And that basically tells you on the left side that women need to fit into the system. Yeah. And you see, the girls and guys on the right side would say, let's change the system. And I think that's a very interesting discussion. And we are working a lot at Inclusive Peace about what does it take to change the system, that the system is fit for, let's call it inclusion and equality, and probably a move towards inclusive societies and not just representation. So I think that's a discussion to come, is how do we change the way political systems are functioning if they are discriminatory? And usually if they are, and there's a lot of research on that, if they're discriminatory to women, they're also discriminatory to other groups. So it's a real issue about changing the system. And I think the whole point is often it doesn't help if you put a quota or if you put a women advisory body into a completely wrong system. So often the talks are designed in a way that's not the right system. Okay, let's go to the next slide. After all this relatively frustrating news, let's move into what can be done. What are those structures of influence, I called it. And this, again, it's a combination. I actually developed it for an ongoing peace process where we're advising. And I put together a lot of information from different writing and observations in the field. So the blue ones show you on the left side, it is those who are at the table. It talks to the insiders who sit at the talks. The right one is the outsiders who have nothing to do with the talks, who are really far away from the talks. And the middle is those who sit in parallel mechanisms and bodies that are geared towards bringing the voices together and then channel them to the talks. So I'm not going through all of it. I'm just picking a few points. So the whole point is, what can you do if you are a member of a delegation? And just to understand what else is there. You could be an advisor to a delegation. You could be a member of a technical working group. You could be a member of a commission. You could be an advisor to a mediator. You could be an observer. It's really interesting if you present this to people who are mediating or who are at the talks. They're very astonished that there are so many options. They always only think, oh, I'm a mediator or there's a delegation. They don't think there is influence possibilities at the table. For example, technical working groups, there's no negotiation in the world without technical working groups. And at the end of the day, they have the power because here the real issues are discussed. And this often lends itself to bring in external experts. So you can flirt with women experts. So I'm just saying there are lots of possibilities. If you look into the right side, there's of course formal consultative mechanisms that are very popular because you put all the civil society and all the women, you took them in one mechanism, and then you outsource it to an international support organization that finds out what all these people want. Then you write a one-pager or even 2,000 pages, give it to the negotiation delegation and tell them, this is what people want. So very popular because you have everybody talking in one voice. But of course, reality is different. And even pre-COVID, we had a lot of, I'd say, online gatherings. In the Colombian peace process, there was an internet platform created for people to say what they want. And they got 15,000 comments and suggestions. It was very interesting. So we interviewed the negotiation delegations and asked them, so how did you absorb this? What did you do with it? And they said, well, the problem was, it was 2,000 pages. And I mean, you can't read 2,000 pages. So we picked out some points. So, and this just shows you also like, is it a tick box exercise or is it just a poor effectiveness on how those who did the transfer? Probably it's a combination of the two. But if you look into mass action, so from all the research we have done, mass action is the most influential tool you can have. And you know this from Lebanon yourself. And the question is, how often can you go to the street? And what are the points, the key points that really unite? And I think this is what you need to plan and bring into the movement, and also, of course, bring gender perspectives into the movement. But mass action is the one and only super, super, super effective tool, but it is, of course, very tricky, and we can talk about it. I want to, in the middle, I mentioned the parallel, the working groups and all this. I would like to mention one last point, and that's representatives to the talks. So in Colombia and also now in the Afghan peace talks, there is a design where those who sit sort of outside come and discuss and will have petitions, papers, comments, but some of them will represent at the talks and bring those papers in person because they found out that this had a bigger effect than just dumping a piece of paper. The other problem with a piece of papers is piece of papers can be extremely effective, especially if they are short to the point and have a set of minimum demands. But it's not enough as a strategy. You need to accompany with a lot of lobbying on all fronts. That brings me to the next slide. So you see there's a lot. There's a lot that can be done. And there's more strategies that can be applied. So this one is a slide which is really in the making. So you are guinea pigs. Because it's pretty repetitive. That's why I'm not happy with it. But again, it takes the insider, so at the talks, it takes the official inclusion mechanisms in the middle, and it takes the outsider strategies. And you see here, what we have not talked before is, if you are at the table, what you can do is build alliances across delegations. So this has happened, for example, in Nepal, where a women caucus was created between all the female members of the delegations, where then when basically women law was to be passed, they all united and said, like, we all want this law to be passed. Interestingly, with this example, because I should have stopped here because then it's a really good example. If I continue, it becomes a different one, because what happened, the law didn't pass. Why did the law didn't pass, which is actually part of the next slide, is because party discipline. So the men in the delegation, the political party leaders said, like, okay, you women united, we hear you, but you are not here because you are women. You are here because you are party members. And we have nominated you as party members, and you have a party discipline, and you vote against this law. This actually happened. On the contrary, in the DRC, Congo, in the Sun City mediation, what happened is that the negotiation got really stuck. And what the women, they united and they blocked the room. And they said, you guys don't leave the room before you sign the agreement. And they signed the agreement. So just to see, it's worth trying. I'm picking out the pushing for gender content. The pushing for gender content is a very tricky issue, often for women at the table. I would like to mention that, because often women at the table who are nominated, as we just said, as politicians, feel often that they need to distance themselves from gender content because that's the weak topics. We want to talk about security arrangements. We want to talk about political structures and not about gender. So that's why you cannot, and interestingly, often the outside women lobby, people think a woman is there, she needs to lobby for gender. That's not the case. Why should she? She has also a lot of other portfolios. So you need to take care of the gender content, and it doesn't need to come from a woman. It can come from a gender advisor, it can come from a gender commission, it can come from gender experts in civil society, just to mention this. And I'm picking out an outsider strategy, and that is working with the media. Working with the media is essential. And of course, it's a different story working with the print and traditional media or with the social media. And interestingly, and I think the Middle East is a very interesting context here, look at the internationals. They do a lot of media monitoring, but they only monitor English-speaking media. Like the Syria Women Advisory Body got almost destroyed on social media and the Arab-speaking social media, which nobody really realized in the international community because they don't read Arabic. So working with the media in a strategic way is very important and is part of a strategic alliance to push for change. And also these alliances, not only between the delegation, but also the alliances between the women at the table and the women in the women movement. There should not be competition, but there should be separate sharing of work and joint strategizing. In the Guatemala Peace Process, the women at the table worked very well with the women in civil society, informed each other and pushed for the same issues at the table and from outside. So I think that is very helpful. I have one more slide, I think. let's go to this one. And that is about what are the factors, the process, and the context factors that enable and constrain women's influence. Let's talk about the context first. And I mentioned already the example of Nepal, because the first and the biggest obstacle in the context is elite resistance. Elites can be, of course, political elites, there can be military elites, there can be also civil society elites, you never know. They are people who are powerful in a society. So also don't only look at political elites, it can be others too. But the point is, if you don't influence them, that's a problem. And interestingly, we find very often, in particular in high-level processes, that especially women advocates, they rely a lot on the international community and like-minded international countries, but they can only limitedly influence the national actors. So the lobbying for the national actors and the elite is key. The other one, and this is very interesting, is that in the long run, you can't change the structures. You can't change anything in the talks if there's no public buy-in. So there need to always be also strategies, the media come into play here, to get public buy-in and elite buy-in at the same time. I just mentioned the one down to the right, and that's existing previous gender provisions. So what we found in the research is in processes where there had been gender provisions, it is easier to pick it up and follow up on it. That means, for example, if you have a process in Yemen not looking very good, still, one day you're going to be able to say and come back to the provisions of the national dialogue. You have to just sort of wait for the moment where you can bring it in again, because the system was already there. It doesn't mean that it's sustainable, but it means it can be picked up all the time. Afghanistan is a real point here, because in Afghanistan, as you can imagine, it was very hard in the 2001 talks to get it in. But because it was so internationalized, they got a 30% quota of all follow-up mechanisms, and women really build on that. And they're not starting from zero now in the talks with the Taliban. And so this really helps. So whatever you do to get gender provisions into any type of agreements, it's not lost, even if the process is not looking good at the very moment. Just on the left side, I mentioned already a process factor before, and that's coalition building, which is very strong. But I want to mention two more points, and that is selection and decision making. So what happens is that selection criteria, who sits where, can have quotas, can have all these ingredients that they will also show legitimacy. So if, for example, gender, age, and other categories are there as selection, because very often, and you know that from your context very well, it's the political criteria, it's the religious criteria, or it's the language criteria, but then often the most obvious, gender and age, are not looked at. So if you can pressure for gender and age as a selection procedure, then this brings automatically more women and also more young women and men in the process. Decision making is the key factor, because what we have seen in many negotiations, be it national dialogues or even smaller or formal negotiations, even the ones who were very gender sensitive, had a lot of inclusion. Often, if you then look into all these women, for example, all these young people present, look into who makes the decisions. Because also in formal structures, you have decision-making mechanisms. And often the decision-making mechanisms are then very exclusionary. So you can have a very inclusionary setup, but you can have a very exclusionary decision-making setup. So when constructing and designing processes, it's not just a representation. Again, that's what we mean with making women count. It's all about the influence. It's influence and power. And that manifests really differently. And this brings me to the end of my talk. I have one more slide, which you can look at probably now, and then also take it with you with a couple of links where you can get more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doctor. This is very helpful in terms of linking what is needed in making women count, not just counting women, with evidence-based studies to include in understanding peace negotiations, and then how the aspect of the role of the insiders, the in-between, the insiders and the outsiders, all those factors, how they play a role in making such peace negotiations more inclusive, and in gender mainstreaming also the provisions that are in the context of the peace agreements. It's not only having women, but to gender mainstream. Another important point also I noticed is, which we also have discussed many times, is that women, discuss women's issues, but not only women's issues. They can discuss different issues as well. I'm not gonna, I have a few questions, but I would like to leave, I will stop sharing first, and then stop sharing, and then see what, maybe we have in the chat box questions, but I would like students to put their videos, show us their faces, and if they have questions, please, I think, let me see who's raising their hand. Ahmed Masri, please. Would you like to question, Ahmed?
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
First of all, good evening, Dr. Paffenholz. It's a real honor to meet you. Well, I read the report 2 or 3 days ago. It's pretty interesting, but I have only one question. There's a position named observer status. You wrote there, and it's not very effective in negotiation. Is it because they are women, or this is the nature of the job or this position? This is my only question.
A few questions and then answer, or answer each?
A few questions and then answer.
Few questions. Okay, let's see. Who has a question here? I'm trying to see through the names. We usually have technical issues if I'm going through the chats. Let me, while, students can...
You can just ask your questions. Don't be shy.
Exactly. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, it's an honor to meet you. It was a very exciting talk, actually. I have a question, and it's not a question, actually. I'd like to know your opinion on the progress of women and their representation in Lebanon and everything we have managed to actually get in terms of rights and other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So
Karen Swed has a question.
I think Karen was just asking.
No, what I do.
Oh, what?
Hello,
Okay.
Dr. Paffenholz.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Go, Karen.
The question is that research has found that when women are present on the negotiation table, the peace agreement becomes more sustainable. I want to ask, what is the variable that is present on the table that is absent if we're not on the table? Like, what's the factor, what's the ingredient that makes the peace agreement more sustainable when we're there?
So if we can rephrase, Karen, because it was a bit lagging, right? I guess, or from my side, it was clear. Okay. I think we had Karim Mitri. You had a question?
Yes, I actually wrote it in the chat box.
Okay, please, we would like to hear your voice and see you.
Yes, hello. So I just wanted to ask about there was a part in the decision making subtitle of the paper where you highlighted the difference between the actual influence of the women and the large numbers that the women have in the decision making process. I'm wondering if you could give an example of this idea. What is the difference between like the large number of participants that are defending these rights and the actual influence of maybe one or two women or maybe even the men in this process.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess we have like 4 or 5 questions. Would you like to respond, Doctor, to those questions?
Yeah, let me jump into it. So I take Ahmed's first with the observer status. You're absolutely right. The observer status is, first of all, a general thing, which is not only related to women, because as observers, you're not allowed to kind of talk during the talks. You're just observing. But of course, we had also exceptions in the talks in Liberia. The women were kind of very active behind the scene. But what we also see in the observer status, there comes not, I would say, interestingly, for once, not a gender dimension, but certainly a power dimension. Because if the United States, for example, has observer status, of course, they mingle a lot behind the scene and push behind the scene. Like take the Afghanistan talks where there have been and still are now again observers, not in the current one because they're not that far, but in 2001 there were observers and they were basically controlling the entire talks. So, which is not the case if you are a civil society organization sitting at the table, but it shows like in the Liberia case where the observers were quite influential, it was their cooperation with the delegation behind the scene in combination with their cooperation with the women movement. So they were systematically passing information from the talks to the women movement, and the women movement then would organize mass mobilization when it fit sort of the table. So it's a bit also in our research, we also had certainly also less data on observer status as for others. Lebanon, do you think I'm crazy and going into this hot thing? But I mean, the only thing I can say, if I compare, of course, Lebanon to other countries in the Middle East, you're pretty advanced. I mean, you know that on women's rights, and yeah, I mean, you are. I think the problem is certainly it's an ongoing process, that's clear. And of course, the gender dimension is overshadowed by the religious dimension and or I'd say by the politicized religious dimension, of course. Yeah. And I think also the problem that the COVID kind of stopped the mass mobilization and the movement where we don't really know where the train would go in the direction, but it means in terms of political transitions in general, I think you can always go and push more in a general climate of change. There is always an openness more also for gender justice. And I think I had the feeling that many actors in Lebanon are very aware of it. So I think you are on a quite fruitful ground, even if you maybe don't realize it yourself. But it doesn't mean that you are not very close to the end. Of course not. Like no country in the world. I wouldn't know any country. Like I lived a long time in Switzerland, and the representation of women in parliament was so low. And only the last election brought, I think, 38% of women in parliament in Switzerland. So welcome to the club and never give up. Okay, Ben.
Perfect.
And so then Karen's question on, I hope I really understood it. Maybe somebody can repeat it. So it's the sustainability. So how many women? Is it the?
So Karen was saying that there's a lot of literature that proves that if women are in the mix, the results are better and longer and more sustainable. The peace is more sustainable. So her question was, what is the ingredient? What is that ingredient that changes the result?
I think that also relates to Karim's question with the numbers and the influence. So as I said in the beginning, there is the evidence-based battle. So the point is, it's a bit tautological because we don't have enough women at the table, and then we kind of measure how it is when we have women at the table and the results become more sustainable. So there is, honestly, from a hardcore research perspective, there's a lot of issues with the methodology of many quantitative studies. I really want to say that because a lot of quantitative studies, they would count 1 and 0. That means, is there a woman at the table? 1. Is there none? 0. So the problem is now they don't look into the different roles. So they would count, and because it's statistical, paper-based studies, what they can do only is looking into the agreement text and into the signatories. So very often the variable becomes how many people have signed the peace agreements, and so many were women, and then they measure, for example, sustainable success only with the data on violence reduction. Because there's a lot of statistics about violence, it's much more difficult to measure a political progress as compared to violence. So this is what a lot of people don't know, and that's why the evidence battle is there, because the policy world just uses the data without reflecting about it. So it's a bit problematic, in my view, to do that. So what we have done is we have looked into what are the trends. First of all, so we started also we didn't count women, as I said, but what we looked into is what are the different spaces at the talks, like observer status, like the delegations, like advisors, like consultative bodies. We looked at all those different bodies, and what we did, which is of course a sort of more hard work, qualitative process tracing. For example, we looked into it. You have a gender quota here. How did it come into the agreement? Who organized this? Who pushed that? So just on the women and gender track. So then we could trace back who had an influence, and then the outcome was very different. It was very often not those signing an agreement, but it was often, as you said, I think, Karim, sometimes a few very influential people, often women, yes. It was often mass mobilization that pushed for something. And there, I think also what Lina said in the beginning came into play. We found that women are not only pushing for gender and women. No, women are pushing actually very often for the peace process to start, for the peace process to continue, and for signatures and for agreements to be signed. So often women are the ones that pushing for that the process goes along and stays alive. So, and they of course contribute to a lot of technical issues in the agreements. So what we did, we looked at all of this and traced back who influenced that. And then what we found out, if you then, of course, have put all those qualitative data together, you can then put it into basically quantitative, I call it baby statistics, where you cross-tabulate and do correlation analysis and see how many of those different influence factors and strategies that I mentioned before have been applied by whom, and then you can see that the entity of this in a peace agreement has resulted into what. And what we looked into, we didn't look into the level of violence, because we know that in most processes there is often still violence ongoing, but this violence is statistically not covered because it's not intergroup violence, all this. So what we looked into is the level of implementation of the agreement. Yeah. So, but we also, there's two ways of doing that. One way of looking into implementation is, like, for example, the Kroc Institute does it, is take all the provisions in the agreement and look into how many have been implemented, and then you make a percentage. We didn't do that. What we did is we did the same, but we did a bit differently in the sense that we said there are some provisions that are simply more important than others. For example, if you have government of national unity agreed upon, that seems to be a bit more important than some minor changes in the school curriculum. Maybe I'm also wrong about the school curriculum, but you know what I mean. We looked into in Burundi, I give you that example, which is we have actually, but with this methodology, we have actually 2 deviations from the CROC database. So you see, it's also not that dramatic. In Burundi, for example, the CROC database says that the peace agreement is fully implemented, while we say it's only partially, because after 10 years of the agreement, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with the biggest mandate of bringing the different groups together, has never been set up. So we would say it's only partially implemented. But then we look at this status of implementation and how all these things came into the agreement and what does it influence. So Karen, your question then in terms of what is the factor, it is not a factor. It is really the combination of different strategies that had applied. So we see really those peace agreements that were successful as such in terms of becoming sustainable, that were also more engendered. It was the ones where you had multiple strategies applied at the same time and where you had women in different spaces pushing basically for both the process to continue and for gender sensitive outcomes.
This is so interesting. I love this. This is really needs to be implemented well. This is on gender. I think, I don't know if you can read the chats, but Karim Hamawi, would you like to state it, Karim, instead of me reading it? Karim Hamawi?
Yes, doctor. Yes, it's fine.
Okay, go ahead.
My question is, like we said, that to give more women representation, we're supposed to form alliances and let all kinds of women of all parties to take part in this. So my question is, to what extent would that work? And most of the time, when people are given power, they get greedy or they forget why they got to these places. So how do we make sure that this doesn't happen and they get corrupt and things like that?
No, go ahead. I was so intrigued by the question that I want to instantly answer, but please go ahead with other questions.
Yes, I think Mark Baroudi. Okay, go ahead, Mark.
So you mentioned in the paper that we shouldn't really rely on quotas. They're not as effective as having women-only delegations. But I wanted to ask, should we move past the need of women-only delegations? Because if we keep those, won't it be seen always as, oh, we have to satisfy their demands? It's always women's issues are a side objective that is somewhat of a burden that they need to take into consideration. Like, wouldn't them being included, not as a separate entity, but in the entity itself, should we move to that point? And is it even possible to move to that point in the next few years?
Okay, and one more question, and maybe Vladimir Abdelnour.
Hello. It's an honor, doctor. It's been amazing. I have two questions. The first is, when is a quota bad? So I'm not a big fan of quotas, but I usually don't know how to explain that quota is not a solution. It's like shutting people up. Just you took your space, just move away, not aiming for more. And my second question is, aside from the theoretical talk and academic talk, what can we do as students? What do you say to us? We're all university students. We have an amazing program. I know it's PowerPoint presentation. What do we need to do on the ground as 20 to 25-year-olds to really make that change, especially in a changing country, as you said?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Of course, we will spend a lot of time on the last one, but let me start with the first one. The alliances. I think you're asking a really, really good question. You're actually to the point, because what happens is actually when we came out with the research 2015, 2016, and we presented it a lot to the women and gender community, and one of the findings was alliance building and coalition building has been more successful as an influencing strategy. So what the policy world did with it is, okay, let's create women platforms. Let's create women alliances. And we have been invited to actually support many of them. And after some time, you think like, wait a moment. So that's the first one. Wait a moment. Can you create alliances from outside? How effective is that? And of course, we have seen this, and without naming any UN agencies, it has been difficult. It has been difficult to create this from outside if you don't have the ownership. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing comes in, and that's exactly what your point is. The gender world is not a power-free space. So very often, it's not just the political, I would say, fighting between, let's say, different political parties, and where you have the politics behind it. And when you say, like, why should I be in alliance? Because, so this is often, even within alliances of civil society, there's a lot of infighting. And there's a lot of infighting. And why is there a lot of infighting? Because it's all about power. That means a lot of people take it as a political step in their power to basically, through a network or a platform, to gain access. So that means at the end, it's not about like, what can we all do for our country? What can we all do for the change? No, what can I do in this network so that I can have a better position in this and that? So that's what we have seen a lot. And the other, of course, power dynamics is, as you rightly said, why should the women on Earth be less in conflict than the men? So it makes absolutely no sense to think that you are in conflict over political issues, and suddenly you bring all the women out of the parties together, and they should just say, oh, we are women, we love each other. Absolutely, for sure. Let's eat some cake and everything is good. Of course, it's not like that. The women have the same hardcore political problems with the other women than the men. So I think the theory of change behind it is coming also out of maybe the women kind of, they just come to terms at a certain stage, because, you know, then the issues come in with, there's motherhood, there's thinking into the future, there's this and that. And that's all that. But there's also all the politics. So as I made from this Nepal example, there was a strong desire of women uniting for a common cause. And that's what we really have seen is effective. When there is a common cause where women think like, this really concerns us. Citizen law about children, for example, from mixed ethnic marriages, not getting passports. Well, that was the case in that country. And they're all united. Or this process is falling apart, and some few people mobilize and say, we can do something. But in a way, it's also linked to the last question, it's not only women who can do something, as we know. So I think there are all these things, and I think what is really important when we talk about platforms and alliances is to do power analysis. Also to look into intersectionality. Who are the women who are there? Are there all the powerful women from their parties? Where are the others? Are there also the women from maybe smaller parties, from underrepresented groups? So I think there's a lot to really look into power dynamics, and that's what it is at the end of the day. It's all about power. But as we all know, power is there to be changed. So, but I'm coming to that. The second one is, and I think, quotas. Mark, and I think there's Vladimir also mentioned that. So there's different things about quota. First of all, to clarify the research. I think I never said I'm against quotas or quotas are less effective. No, I think the mix-up is that what we have seen in the data is that if you have a possibility of having women-only delegations, like you had in Yemen, you had in Northern Ireland, for example. This usually brings the gender experts, the women activists, into these delegations, which means that is very effective for pushing gender provisions into agreements. While if you have a quota, as I mentioned earlier, it's less effective for gender provisions, only for that, because the women in the delegations have so many other topics to address, not only gender. While the women-only delegations usually are comprised out of the gender experts. So, however, the quota as such in the long run is the most effective instrument because it often sets a precedent to have more women and gender justice in the post-agreement phase. So I think it depends really what you want. What's the goal of the exercise? But what we always say when we help design processes, it is about having maximum possibilities. So the Yemeni National Dialogue, even people say it failed, it never failed. It failed in implementation. The Yemeni National Dialogue, I think, is a wonderful example of how diversity in a process can go. You have a separate delegation for women, for youth, for a geographical underrepresented South. You have a quota across delegation. So I think if you want the maximum, that's the way to go, because then you get it all in. So now on quotas as such, as you said, Mark, a lot of people have issues with quotas. And my colleague Sarah, who is also here, she just leads our project on temporary special measures. I've learned this word because I also didn't know it was a term. But it means the idea of quotas is it's temporary until there is gender justice or whatever justice. So I think the interesting thing here, in my view, is I mentioned that example actually in another call today. In Kenya, there was a set of different commissions, and they all gender mainstreamed the commission. So there was equal representation and stuff like that. But they set up one commission, which is called the National Integration and Cohesion Commission. I think it could be a very interesting example for Lebanon, where you look into how can you permanently, it's a permanent government commission, how can you permanently screen everything in society? That means school curricula, that means the diplomatic service, that means parastatals, that means everything in society, universities, for basically inclusion in a broader understanding, political inclusion, religious inclusion, gender inclusion. And a commission that has a mandate to drive a society forward and to monitor and to make suggestions for this. I find this a very, very interesting tool. And if quotas are there, so if you say you're uneasy with a quota because it's in a way not just because you have to hammer a certain thing, all taken, I agree. However, it seems to be statistically necessary to get there. So that means if you look at the Nordic countries with the highest representation of women in parliament, they all got there through a quota. None of them got there another way. So there is a lot of evidence that quotas can work. But of course, they come along with a lot of issues. So now the last question, which is, of course, the super question. What can you all do? And that's, of course, the most important one. I don't know even where to start. There's so much you can do. But you know it. In the sense that, first of all, again, the first question is to do for what? Remember the slide with the goals? What exactly do you want to change? What is your change agenda? What are the big things that you want to change? And what are the small things you want to change? There are things you can change every day in the morning. And that usually my recommendation is to wake up in the morning and think, what is it what I can contribute to change today? So that's the small changes. Then maybe every month you ask yourself, what is it what I can contribute to bigger change? What is the bigger change? And then where are your peers? Where are your alliances where you can come together and think about that? If you want to say we want to do something for gender justice in your country, then map out what your best influence areas are. Where can you influence? Of course, you start with the university. That's your immediate influence. You make a mapping of where's your influence zone. And then when you know where your influence zone is, you start developing strategies. And then you need to be setting priorities. You need to find out, where do we put our energy? Is it worth to change the university structure? Because we're already gone in 2-3 years. But if we don't do it, but you need to also really select the battles you want to fight. So that means really looking into what is it what you can do? And there's almost a change thing you can do every morning. And even if it's just smiling at the right person at the right time. So I think that's really important, because that's the precondition that you can do the bigger change. You cannot be making smaller changes. No way you can do bigger changes. And I think the political challenges in Lebanon are very clear. Everybody knows them. So it's a very difficult time to do this under COVID. but COVID will not last forever. What are the preparatory strategies that you can all discuss now so that you have them in place when the time is right? You have already good networks and a lot of things. Prioritize, use the time to strategize, to think really where do you want to have change, and also be realistic. Be realistic in terms of what is the change we can also achieve, and then what's the change we maybe not be able to achieve, but we maybe can set. We can put some flocks here and there so that the ball keeps rolling, maybe for the next generation. But as young people, you have all the power because you are the future. So that means if you also push for gender, push also for age quotas. There need to be more young people everywhere in decision making and all of this. But if you don't demand it, you're not going to get it. So I think we should not get stuck also in it's all about women or it's about gender. No, it is about a just and equal society. And I think young people are so underrepresented in decision making. And that's, I think, a difference of let's ask young people. Think about the youth peace and security agenda of the UN. That has changed a lot. I have been in more meetings where there are more younger people than 5 years ago, but that's not enough. So I think there is, of course, a lot of social media. You own social media. You can change the world with social media. But there needs to be a lot of effort, and there needs to be a lot of counter-blogging to a lot of things that are maybe not right. So I think you have ample possibilities. The point is really to say, we can do it, and that's for sure you can do it. I have heard you speaking, you can do it. So the question is really just choosing the area, what you want to do, and then you just change it, and you know you can do it.
You need to unmute yourself, Tanya, for some reason.
I for some reason thought this was my final statement because I think that's really what it is. It is that you, if I say this, I say this to my children, if you don't change the world, I'm tired. I'm doing it all my life. So you have to do it. And I think you have to also show us generation that is like, I'm a complete, like, I'm so useless on social media. But you are not. And I think you can change so many things. I think the point is really of having this clarity of what you want to change and starting with the small things that will give you the power and the wisdom where the big things are. That's my final word. Thank you.